Welcome back. You're watching Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Corella Hara. Thanks so much for joining us on this Sunday, July 21st, and no shortage of news. Truly a historic week when it comes to American politics. Once again, a live look out there at the White House because we are on election 2024 watch. Today, the big breaking news: Biden officially dropping out of the presidential race and endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris for that spot. Let's continue on with this conversation and keep it going throughout the rest of the night. I'd like to bring in now to the program Rich Rubino, political analyst. Rich, always good to see you. You joined us on a little bit earlier as this news broke. As I mentioned to the guests before, the dust has kind of settled. And interestingly enough, you were on yesterday as well, kind of talking to us a little bit about the Trump rally, campaign strategies going forward. And even you commented to me how different the landscape is really from just 24 hours ago.
Oh, absolutely. I think for Donald Trump, there's a certain playbook that you run against when you're running against an incumbent president. And I think the fact that Joe Biden had job approval rating over 40% made it so that he could essentially go after Joe Biden. Now we're in a scenario that I think if Vice President Harris is the nominee, Biden would largely run in the same playbook, saying that essentially it's a Biden-Harris administration and trying to blame her for the faults of the administration. However, if it's somebody else, specifically, as I was saying yesterday, if it's somebody from outside of Washington, then it's completely new playbook because it's very hard to try to allegate that person with the Biden administration when they really had nothing to do with it. Or for that matter, if it's a United States Senator, specifically if it's a United States Senator who kind of just got there the last couple of terms, it would be a lot different playbook. I think that it kind of upsets the apple cart in that respect.
I've asked a similar question to other analysts that we've had on the show, but I'd like to get different perspectives from people that are closely watching this race, laying the groundwork once again for our viewers and kind of talking about Kamala's strategy heading into the DNC, because she's been endorsed by quite a few big political figures since that news broke, but she does not have that official nomination yet. That will take place in the DNC, set for next month. So what lies in the road ahead for Kamala Harris and her campaign? What accomplishments are they looking to highlight?
I think for Kamala Harris, I think that it's going to be very interesting. I think I think the case she would try to make is that she was somebody who was a prosecutor. She's somebody who was a former United States Senator, who was a vice president, who's really kind of moved up the ranks in that respect. I think they would probably say something like it's good to have a prosecutor against a convicted felon. I think that's kind of the linguistically how they would handle that. But I think it's interesting that most of the people at the convention are establishment type people. That's why they're there, right? They're not necessarily insurgents, and that's something that definitely benefits her. But I do think there'll be somebody else that potentially could come out. And let's say this is a brokered convention. It'll be the first time since 1952 that you actually have a brokered convention. It's actually a matter of trying to get delegates and to try to get delegates to go to one candidate or another. I think another candidate would say we need to kind of break from the Biden administration. Break from the Biden administration. We need somebody from outside Washington, and that would be the message they would send. That's why I'm looking at somebody like, for example, from a swing state, Governor Whitmer from Michigan, Governor Cooper from North Carolina, maybe Governor Shapiro from Pennsylvania, although I don't think he would be willing to run this early because he had just been elected. But they would try to run as the insurrectionist candidate, right? Kind of running against the establishment and saying that, well, we respect what the Biden-Harris administration did. We need somebody who's fresh, who has a fresh outlook, and we need somebody who's going to be able to muster support from swing voters as well as animating the base.
Let's head back to kind of the Republican reaction and also for Democrats with this news. So we have had quite a few Democrats over the last several days call on President Biden to drop out. That finally happened today. But really, the long-term goal is for them to win the presidency, win the most seats in the House and in the Senate. How does this shakeup, so to speak, change that? Do you think that they are still confident that they can have the vote of the American people come November?
I think that in terms of the House and the Senate, there's just a sigh of relief within the Democratic Party. They did not want Joe Biden on the top of the ticket The last thing you want, if you're somebody from a swing state, let's say John Tester from Montana, for example, a state that went for 16 points for Donald Trump. John Tester, 2 years after John Tester was reelected, the last thing John Tester wants in 2024 is an opponent on the debate stage when you ask questions to the opponent to say, do you support Vice President Biden, who's extremely unpopular in Montana? Do you support him as a nominee? Do you support him over Donald Trump? And then he has to kind of wiggle his way out of it by saying something to the effect of, well, yes, I support my party's nominee, but we really need to focus on the issues in Montana, and I will focus, something like that. They want somebody that can at least be neutral, maybe somebody that can both energize the base and somehow inoculate themselves from criticisms that they're either too liberal on the one side, on the other side, that they're incompetent, or that they're part of what is generally, at least contemporaneously, an historic and an unpopular administration. They want somebody else. Now, if it's Vice President Harris, her job approval rating isn't that much higher. She's under 40% as well. That's why I think from a strategic standpoint, from a strategic and tactical standpoint, if you will, it's probably better for the Democrats to nominate somebody that's completely outside of Washington, that can build on, that would say something to the effect of, look, there are a lot of accomplishments that under the Biden administration. They would take credit for the Democrats, talk about the Chips and Science Act, for example, and then they would say, this is what I want to do. This is what I've done in my state. I've worked with people on the other side, something to that effect. And you really take Donald Trump off of the familiar playbook that I think he's hoping to run against, that would have been first President Biden and now Vice President Harris.
Both parties, the Republican and Democratic parties, they have been calling for unity throughout this entire election process. So the Republicans have seemed to kind of work that out, all of them backing behind former President Trump. On the Democratic side, what challenges are they going to face to try to get behind that one specific candidate? Do you think that they're going to achieve that? And if they cannot, what is that going to say about the state of the race?
I think that, yeah, I do. I absolutely think that they will unify, not because they necessarily like the person who the nominee is going to be, although I think that they're Democrats and this is going to be somebody who's been elected as a Democrat. But the fact that there is just such antipathy and enmity toward Donald Trump. Running against Donald Trump for the Democrats, it's not like running against, say, Mitt Romney or Bob Dole or any other Republican kind of standard bearer establishment Republican, where they would say, well, we have better ideas, but they wouldn't necessarily be disappointed. They believe, at least many of the Democratic high command, that this is a race for the future of democracy. So accordingly, they would unify between just about anybody, which actually gives that Democrat some leeway to move to the center, to try to siphon off some of those kind of very elusive, persuadable centrist voters. Because I can't see a scenario where the Democrat moves so far to the right that people are going to say, for example, except for some on the far left, they're going to say, you know what, this candidate is essentially a carbon copy of Donald Trump. Therefore, I'm going to vote for the Green Party candidate, Jill Stein. No, I think this party is very unified, not for one candidate, but they're very much unified against Donald Trump.
Continuing on this tangent of unification, especially within the Democratic Party, I do want to bring up this tweet here, courtesy of Bloomberg. Josh Wingrove here saying Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer does not intend to challenge Vice President Kamala Harris and run for the Democratic presidential nomination. David Welch reports from Michigan. So are we kind of going to see a similar outcomes and reactions from, again, because you mentioned Gretchen Whitmer, she was one of those candidates that could possibly be someone that the DNC could nominate as the president?
Yes, and I think a lot of these candidates who are going to be making these announcements right now, and I'm thinking Governor Cooper being one of them, are probably looking for the vice presidential slot. And I think Governor Whitmer, I think, is probably going to serve out her full term. I don't know if necessarily she's going to be on the ticket, but I do think that I think that someone like Governor Cooper, just because he's not running, he's just at the end of his term, this would be a logical step for him, if you will, and it wouldn't necessarily hurt his political career or hurt his day job. Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania is somebody who's been very attractive to the Democratic seat, to the Democratic fold. I think he'll probably make an announcement as well that he would not be challenging Vice President Harris. Would he take the vice presidency? I don't know if he does take the vice presidential. If he does take the vice presidential slot, I don't know. I think you're going to hear from other candidates too that are probably going to say they're not going to do it. Mark Kelly, the senator from Arizona, former astronaut, and I think probably someone like Raphael Warnock, the senator from Georgia, will probably also make those endorsements. But that doesn't mean that they're not necessarily applicable for the vice presidential for the vice presidential slot, however, and I think that well, I don't think he should be a first choice. I think Governor Whitmer would certainly be one of the possibilities for Vice President Harris as a vice presidential running mate.
Okay, let's continue on with this train of thought. It was one of my questions. Let's say Vice President Harris does get this presidential nomination at the Democratic National Convention. Who is her choice for running mate? Who is going to make the best a person to be on that ticket with her to ensure that the Democrats they get this vote and this nomination?
Well, again, you talk about Governor Shapiro. Potentially, could he put Pennsylvania? Pennsylvania is obviously in play. It's very hard to envision a scenario where the Republicans win without Pennsylvania. He's a relatively popular governor of the state of Pennsylvania. The problem with him is he just got elected governor of Pennsylvania a year and a half ago. He'd be seen as very arrogant if he's arrogant, to accepting the vice presidential slot already. And when he runs for re-election 2 years down the road, that's something a Republican opponent would use against him. Governor Beshear in Kentucky would be a very attractive candidate, 46 years old from the outer rim south state of Kentucky. The problem is he certainly would not bring Kentucky. Kentucky hasn't been in place since 1996. So I look again to North Carolina and look at Roy Cooper, and I look for this state with 14 electoral votes, somebody who's very popular in the state, somebody who's been elected at least twice as governor and prior to that for lower office, somebody who's popular in that state, somebody who has a Southern accent. Southern accent candidates inoculate themselves from criticism that they're too liberal. Witness Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, who had both been elected respectively in Georgia and Arkansas. And he also has an association with Vice President Harris, and that they both served as attorney generals concomitantly. So I think that he's somebody, and he's at least has some charisma to him. He's about 67 years old. He's somebody that I think, and North Carolina, by the way, is not so much vital for the Democrats, but it's vital for the Republicans to win those 14 electoral votes. Last time around, it was the closest state that Donald Trump had won. And it's really the only swing state, by the way, that Joe Biden was really competing in. He figured every other swing state was every other state that Donald Trump won last time is not competitive except for North Carolina. If the Democrats can put North Carolina in play, that would certainly, I think, probably give him the election. Now, the question is, would he actually do that? How much support could he actually give, and how much do people care in the state of North Carolina that he's a home state governor? The answer is usually when someone's on home state, when someone's home state, if they're the presidential or vice presidential nominee, usually it gives them about 2 or 3 percentage points. It'll get some people that are Democrats and maybe were disenfranchised, low propensity, saying I want a North Carolinian on the ticket. But I just think from looking at paper, looking at a pure, cold, calculated perspective, I think he would be the most redoubtable candidate.
We've also been speaking a lot about the polls heading into this November election. There's been a lot of polling happening over the last several weeks, kind of pitching and putting Kamala up against the former President Donald Trump. In your opinion, how do those polls kind of affect even the way that voters think and how Kamala can stand up against Trump? What have you seen lately in regards to those type of surveys that have been happening across the country?
Kamala Harris, like Joe Biden, is not popular in this country. Despite all the time they've spent barnstorming the country, trying to get the message out, what they've accomplished, the fact of the matter is that it has basically gone on deaf ears, and they have not been able to get over 50%. Now, contrary-wise, Donald Trump has not been able to get over 50% either. This is one of those elections where there are a lot of quote-unquote double dislikers, a lot of people that don't like either of the two major party candidates. I think if you look at the polls, President Trump does about the same with Vice President Harris as he does. Maybe she's a couple of points higher, but as Vice President Harris, as Joe Biden, and for that matter, many of the other candidates too, basically poll about the same. What that tells me is that we're in an era right now where Republicans are going to vote for the Republican nominee, Democrats are going to vote for the Democratic nominee, pretty much no matter who it is. Now, obviously, it benefits you who the person is, and if it's somebody, for example, from a certain state, for example, if it was Governor Whitmer, who's relatively popular in the state of Michigan, and she were the nominee, and she were to bring the state of Michigan, that's something that you would have differently than Vice President Harris, who's from a very, very blue state of California and is seen as kind of associated with Washington. But I think that Donald Trump, part of his strategy, by the way, would be to try to run against California if she's the nominee. So try to link her with Nancy Pelosi, try to link them all to San Francisco and Oakland, that area, and use terms like Democrat-run cities, something to that effect. I think that he'll try to run against the Biden-Harris administration. I also think he'll try to say that red states are governed more effectively and that blue states are very feckless. That's kind of the messaging that I think that he's probably meeting with his strategists to talk about.
You know, Rich, so many news outlets around the world are talking about this big news. And I'm curious, in your opinion, if you think that there's maybe a topic that hasn't been touched on as of yet or hasn't really been focused on that you think is important for people to watch out for heading into November.
That's a re- that's a really good question. Actually, I would say that foreign policy is really taking kind of a back burner. I think part of that is because people generally don't focus on that unless we're in a major war. Generally speaking, instead they focus on more domestic issues. I think you're going to see the traditional issues come out. Obviously, Social Security, Medicare, particularly in some of the states with some of the states like North Carolina with older voters. But I don't think there's necessarily some sort of at least yet there's not necessarily that I can think of some sort of a surreptitious issue that's going to come in kind of an October surprise. But that doesn't mean that there not won't necessarily be something that might come up as some sort of an October surprise that really kind of upsets the established way of being. But we'll see.
You know, Rich, with the way that things have been going throughout this entire election season, I wouldn't be surprised if we continue to get major breaking news. As I think there was a comment that I heard earlier today, just this week, it feels like decades worth of news and
Yes.
history has been made. So, Rich, I always appreciate your insight here. And then I do want to leave you with the final word. Anything else that you would like to add on a personal note as we follow these developments?
Yes, absolutely. The first thing I thought of is you go back and you're going to hear a lot of analogies to Lyndon Johnson back in 1968. In this case, Lyndon Johnson was giving a speech, and at the end, he was giving a speech about Vietnam. And at the end of the speech, he said, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. This was the last time you had an incumbent president announce that they were not seeking reelection. Very similar circumstances. Both Joe Biden and Donald Trump started, for example, but Joe Biden and Lyndon Baines Johnson began as a United States senator. They were first elected when they were 29, Johnson to the House, respectively, Biden to the United States Senate. They're both very much creatures of Washington. And in Johnson's case, he figured he could not win the nomination of his own party. His poll in Wisconsin showed Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy was probably going to beat him. But you know what happened after Johnson made that announcement? He was seen as a statesman. He was praised roundly on both the right and the left, and he had a relatively good year legislatively in terms of 1968. I think there are many parallels with President Johnson. The big difference, I think, is that Joe Biden actually went through an entire nomination process, won 15 million votes, whereas Johnson pretty much did announce he would not run for reelection. And this was, in this case, right after the Hampshire primary, and his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, ended up eventually winning the nomination. And in that case, Humphrey did have challenge and won this major challenge from Eugene McCarthy. But I think there are a lot of eerie similitudes in play.
Rich Rubino, I truly appreciate always your insight as we continue to follow the rest of this election
Absolutely.
process in 2024. We still have a few months away. Well, about 107 days, I think, exactly until those
But who's
November
counting?
elections. But who's counting, right? But yes, always good to see you here. And of course, we're looking ahead to the DNC when we will finally get to know who is officially going to be running against the former President Donald Trump. So we'll look to speak with you throughout the course of these events. And of course, you take care. We'll talk soon.
Thank you as well.